News of the Times, stalked by her brother-in-law, the Christmas murder that shook post-war Britain in 1918. Liverpool, 1918. In the winter of 1918, Britain was a country trying very hard to feel hopeful again. The armistice had been signed only weeks before. The church bells still rang with celebration. In cities like Liverpool, shop windows glowed with early Christmas displays, and people spoke tentatively of peace, of rebuilding, and of the lives they might now reclaim. But inside one ordinary terraced house in the Paddington district, a very different set of emotions was taking hold. 29-year-old widow Mary Ellen Rooney had endured more loss than most women of her age. 2 husbands dead, a world war that seemed to swallow up every certainty, and the daily struggle of raising 4 children in the uneasy quiet that followed the guns falling silent abroad. And now, in this fragile new peace, she found herself navigating a danger far closer to home, a danger she had already tried to escape. For months, Mary had been followed, questioned and threatened by a man who should have been her protector, her own brother-in-law, William Rooney. His jealousy grew, his drinking worsened, his behaviour, the family said, became wild. And before long, Mary began telling neighbours that she no longer felt safe in her own street. On a cold November afternoon, as she stepped into a small corner shop for a few simple errands, her attempts to evade him came to an end. Witnesses would later describe the scene as sudden, furious, and chillingly decisive. The moment a family dispute erupted into a public murder that stunned the community. This is the story of a killing committed not by a stranger in the night, but by a man whose footsteps Mary had heard behind her for far too long. A murder that took place just as Britain was beginning to breathe again, and a stark reminder that while the war might have ended, violence could still rise from within one's own household. Tonight, we step into post-war Liverpool, into a case shaped by obsession, grief, and a woman's quiet attempt to find safety in a world still reeling from conflict. This is the murder of Mary Ellen Rooney, and the terrible warning signs that went unheeded. And from our end of segment further particulars, we venture to Widnes, where an accident with a revolver was followed quite unbelievably by a second accident meant to explain the first. The result is every bit as disastrous as you fear. Settle in with a steady drink and let the years fall away. We're travelling now to Liverpool in 1918, where the end of the Great War brought hope to many, but not to everyone. Liverpool, December 1918. In December 1918 found Liverpool and Britain in a state of exhausted celebration. The armistice had been signed only a few weeks earlier, and the country was still adjusting to the quiet that followed 4 years of relentless news from the front. The streets were brighter than they'd been in years. Shops hung small displays of greenery, church bells rang with a mixture of relief and remembrance, and people spoke of peace with the tentative hopefulness of those who had forgotten what peace felt like. Yet, beneath the surface, life was far from simple. Thousands of soldiers were returning home, some injured, some deeply changed, all trying to fit back into lives that had moved on without them. Women who had taken on essential war work were now being asked politely or otherwise to step back. Food rationing still lingered, coal remained scarce, and prices continued to rise in ways that frustrated households up and down the country. Liverpool, a major port throughout the war, carried its own scars. Many families had lost loved ones to the conflict. Many more were waiting anxiously for men who were still trickling back in uncertain batches. The influenza pandemic, too, had swept through the city in waves, leaving an uneasy awareness that peace on paper did not always mean safety in practice. In working class districts like Paddington, daily life was a mixture of grief, resilience, and practical necessity. Corner shops were busy again. Neighbours looked in on one another. Children played in the streets, the war already fading into something they would later remember only through stories. And households, especially those led by widows, tried to stitch together a semblance of normality after years of disruption. It was a world balancing celebration with sorrow, hope with hardship, a world in which people were trying with varying degrees of success to rebuild. And into this fragile moment, this uneasy in-between winter, stepped Mary Ellen Rooney, a young widow navigating not only the burdens of the post-war years, but a danger that crept far closer to home than anyone realised. The plight of war widows in 1918 Britain. For many women in 1918, the signing of the armistice did not bring an end to hardship. Britain counted over 200,000 war widows by the close of the Great War, and while the nation celebrated peace, these women faced a very different future, one marked by reduced income, limited housing, and an uncertain social position. The government issued pensions, but they were modest, tightly controlled, and often insufficient to support a household. Many widows were expected to return to domestic service or factory work while also caring for young children, a task that left little room for rest or recovery. And as soldiers returned home, women who had filled vital wartime roles were quietly pushed back into more traditional, lower-paid positions. In places like Liverpool, the strain was even sharper. Rents climbed, employment wavered, and the influenza pandemic had thinned families already worn by grief. For widows, safety nets were fragile at best. Many depended heavily on neighbours, extended family, or the rare benevolent employer. Against this backdrop, a woman like Mary Ellen Rooney, twice widowed, living in cramped conditions, raising 4 children, was particularly vulnerable. And when the threat came not from a stranger in the street, but from within her own family, her options for protection became heartbreakingly limited. Though shocking in every detail, the story of Mary Ellen Rooney appeared only as a small column in a handful of regional newspapers. In late 1918, the press was preoccupied with far larger headlines: the return of thousands of soldiers, many of them broken in body or spirit, and the nation's uneasy attempt to knit itself back together after 4 years of devastation. Amid such sweeping anxieties, the death of a young Liverpool widow, stalked, terrorised, and killed in broad daylight by her own brother-in-law, barely stirred the surface. A few brief reports, a stark description, and then silence. It is from these scattered lines that we now reconstruct the events of that November afternoon. From the Empire News and the Umpire, the 3rd of November 1918. Woman stabbed. Police arrest brother-in-law. Last evening, the Liverpool police arrested William Rooney on a charge of stabbing his sister-in-law, Mary Ellen Rooney, in a shop in Paddington. The tragedy took place during the afternoon, and the woman was removed to the Royal Infirmary, where she died about a couple of hours after admission. Rooney will appear before the magistrates on Monday on a charge of wilful murder. In a world already exhausted by loss, the murder of one woman on a Liverpool street barely stirred public attention. Britain was only just beginning to comprehend the human cost of the Great War. Entire regiments gone, families hollowed out, thousands of men returning maimed or traumatized. Against such vast suffering, the death of a young widow with 4 children stabbed while shopping for their tea appeared a small and sorrowful footnote. Yet behind that fleeting headline lay a far darker truth. Mary Rooney had not been struck down by a stranger, but by the very man who lived across the street, a brother-in-law whose unwanted attention had shadowed her movements for months. The violence that erupted in that Paddington shop was not sudden at all, but the culmination of a fear Mary had quietly carried along before the papers took any notice. And at the inquest, those quiet fears would begin to be revealed. From the Liverpool Echo, the 4th of November 1918, City tragedy, man in court, remand ordered. William, 51, of Elm Grove, Smithdown Lane, who was charged with the wilful murder of his sister-in-law, Mary Ellen Rooney, on Saturday, was brought before the stipendiary today and remanded as well. Detective Chief Inspector Holbrook saying the coroner's inquiry would be held on Wednesday and asked for a remand until that day. Detective Sergeant Sweeney, who gave evidence of arrest, said that when charged, Rooney was sober and replied, "I'll say nothing now." Prisoner bore marks of a conflict. One of his eyes was badly discoloured, and on one side of his head was a medical dressing. Detective Inspector Arthur Jones and Detective Sergeant Sweeney discovered that the man had had a quarrel with the woman Mary Ellen Rooney, aged about 30 years, who lived at 17 Elm Grove, and shortly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon followed her into a shop in Paddington, where she was purchasing eggs and, producing a knife, is alleged to have stabbed her in the neck. Diana Jacks, daughter of the shopkeeper, called for help, whereupon her father ran out of the kitchen and seized the assailant, whom was pushed out of the shop. Rooney, however, continued to keep hold of the injured woman, dragging her after him. Contriving to free herself, she then ran across the street, followed by the accused, who is said to have struck her again with the knife. What, then, could drive a man of 51 to stab a near relation in the middle of a Liverpool street, a week before Christmas, and in full view of passers-by? As the inquest unfolded, it became clear this was no sudden quarrel, no momentary lapse of temper. Mary Ellen Rooney had long understood the danger she was in. She had spoken of her fears to more than one person, and her reluctance to visit her elderly mother-in-law, a task she had once done willingly, was itself a quiet testimony to the pressure she lived under. The picture that emerged was not of a single violent act, but of months of unwelcome attention, thwarted demands, and a woman who had slowly tried to pull herself out of reach. And with that, the inquest testimony began. From the Liverpool Echo, the 6th of November 1918, Inquest Revelations at Coroner's Inquiry. A murder verdict. Evidence of jealousy and unwelcome attentions. The story of the stabbing affray in Paddington on Saturday, in connection with which William, 51, is in custody on the charge of wilfully murdering his sister-in-law, Mary Ellen Rooney, aged 32, widow of a soldier, was told today before the city coroner and jury. Mary Ann Given, mother of the dead woman, gave evidence of identification. Her daughter had lost 2 husbands in the war, the second, whom she had married about 2 years ago, being the brother of the prisoner. A few months ago, Mrs. Rooney complained of the unwelcome attentions which her brother-in-law was paying. She said he wanted her to marry him, but she declined. Rooney used to go to her mother-in-law's house to help her in the housework, but ceased to do so because of the manner which the prisoner used to pester her. She told the witness that he had said he would have her life sooner than anyone else would have her. Mrs. Rooney was very much afraid of the prisoner and in consequence ceased to go to her mother-in-law's house. One day last week, when she was in the elder Mrs. Rooney's house, the accused threatened her with a knife because she refused to go to the pictures with him. His mother said, "You will be hanged for that." And he replied, "I won't. I'll kill myself." An uncle of the dead woman said she had made similar complaints to him about Rooney's conduct, and in consequence witness went to see him. Rooney said it was his younger brother to whom the complaint referred, and he promised to talk to him. Witness sent his niece away for a fortnight, and since she had come back, he had heard no more of the affair, and he thought it had died down. Scene in a shop. Diana Jacks, daughter of a shopkeeper in Paddington, said that Mary Ellen Rooney came into the shop followed by the prisoner, who seized her by the shoulder. She asked what he wanted, and he said to take revenge. He raised his hand, in which was a knife, and struck her in the neck. There was a struggle, and the woman ran out, followed by the man. Elias Jacks, who was attracted into the shop by his daughter's cry, said he saw the man and the woman on the road. The former had a knife in his hand, and he struck her 2 blows in the neck. Some men rushed at Rooney, and he was pulled away. Dr. Strock, who was passing in his car at the time, said he rendered assistance to the woman at the time. He described the wounds sustained and said a sliced wound had cut the jugular vein. PC 70B, Albert Potts, who arrested the prisoner, said the latter, when taken into custody, replied, "I have done now. I will not run away." Mrs. Elizabeth Rooney, mother of the prisoner, said the latter's father had been in Rainhill Asylum for 5 months. One of his brothers died in Rainhill, and 2 of his sisters and 1 of his brothers had also been out of their minds. Dr. J.E.C. Matthews of the Royal Infirmary, describing the attention which the deceased woman had received at the hospital and to performing an operation, she died of hemorrhaging due to the wounds. The jury returned a verdict of wilful murder, and Rooney was committed to the Manchester Assizes for trial. Throughout the hearing of the evidence, Rooney declined to ask witnesses any questions, and in reply to the usual question whether he desired to make any statement, he said, "I will say nothing now." Despite the gravity of the testimony, and despite the clear pattern of a woman being stalked long before her murder, the case itself barely troubled the columns of the local press. In a nation crowded with returned soldiers, many of them broken in body, spirit, or both, William Rooney was to the newspapers simply another troubled man in a country full of them. And as the case moved toward trial, there was never any doubt that Rooney's defence would lean heavily on the language of insanity, pointing to a family history steeped in asylum admissions. But unlike the Victorian stories of inherited madness that once filled the public imagination, this plea stirred little interest and even less sympathy. War had produced its own legions of shattered minds. One more claim of hereditary instability drew barely a murmur. And so, with minimal fanfare, the trial began. From the Liverpool Echo, the 25th of November 1918, the shop crime, death sentence in city tragedy. What accused said and the strange story unfolding at the assizes. The Liverpool murder charge came to Manchester assizes today when William, 51, labourer, who killed his sister-in-law, Mary Ellen Rooney, was found guilty and sentenced to death. Mr. E. G. Hemmerd, prosecuting, said Rooney was married to the prisoner's younger brother, a soldier, who was killed in France in July, and since her widowhood had lived with her mother in Elm Grove in Liverpool, the prisoner living almost opposite with his mother. He seems to have paid his sister-in-law some attention since the brother's death, but she had refused to marry him. He appeared to have a jealous disposition, for when Mrs. Rooney declined to the pictures with him, he threatened to kill her. She was so frightened that her uncle sent her away to the south of England. On her return, the family was visited by a soldier named Champion, who was on leave. He stayed at the house with Mrs. Rooney and her mother. The prisoner seemed to have been irritated seeing him and Mrs. Rooney together, and he shook his fist towards them in the street. Later, when the woman was shopping, he attacked her with a knife. There was a struggle, during which the prisoner stabbed the woman several times with a butcher's bone knife and was then knocked down by someone from the shop. The woman died the same night. After being arrested, the prisoner said, "My younger brother was killed. I saw something last night and the same again today." In cross-examination, Mr. Sandbach sought to show that the prisoner had been strange and somewhat wild in his manner, and with this one of the witnesses agreed. Mr. Sandbach said, "It was common ground that the prisoner came of tainted stock so far as mental deficiency was concerned. His father, 2 brothers and a sister had been in the asylum. He suggested that there was a strong inference that the only motive for the violent attack was that the prisoner was not responsible for his actions. As to the words used on his arrest, he suggested that there might have been some supernatural incident connected with his brother's death, preying on a disordered mind. After the jury had found the prisoner guilty, he said he had no statement to make. The trial itself passed with a swiftness that surprised even those who attended. Whether it was a national exhaustion following the end of the war, a simple lack of public interest, or a profound sympathy for a young mother of four murdered in broad daylight, the proceedings felt almost perfunctory. There was no real momentum behind a petition for clemency, no groundswell for commutation. In a country overwhelmed by grief, Rooney's fate seemed merely one tragedy among thousands. And so, just 1 week before Christmas, and scarcely 3 weeks after the armistice, William Rooney was taken to the gallows. His execution on the 17th of December 1918 passed much as the case had begun, quietly, briefly, and with little notice. From the Bolton Evening News, the 17th of December 1918, crime of jealousy. Murderer hanged at Strangeways. A Liverpool man, William Rooney, 51, sentenced to death at the last Manchester Assizes for having killed his deceased brother's widow, was executed at Strangeways this morning. According to the story told at the trial, Rooney was actuated by motives of jealousy and unrequited love. Rooney's brother was killed in France in July last, and since then he has forced his attentions upon his sister-in-law. She rejected him, and one day in September he threatened to kill her. Subsequently, the couple got on friendly terms. On November the 1st, he saw the woman speaking to a soldier in the street, and in a fit of jealousy, he followed her to a shop and struck her in the neck with a knife. There was a struggle in which the woman was stabbed several times. Counsel who defended Rooney at the assizes set up a plea of insanity and urged that the man was not responsible for his actions at the time. And so the case of Mary Ellen Rooney slipped, much like its earliest headlines, into the margins of post-war Britain. A young widow killed in a moment of jealous rage, 4 children left motherless, a man hanged within weeks of the armistice while the country tried to piece itself back together. It was not a story that shaped national memory, nor one that lingered long in the public mind. But for those who lived in that small corner of Liverpool, for her family, her neighbours, the witnesses who heard her cry out in the shop, it was a stark reminder that peace on paper does not always bring peace at home. Mary had sensed the danger that followed her. She spoke of it, tried to avoid it, did what she could within the narrow choices available to a woman of her circumstances. In the end, those fears were realized in the most public and heartbreaking of ways. Today, what surprised is not a grand narrative, but a scattering of short articles and the quiet echo of a life interrupted. A story almost lost amid the noise of history, yet no less deserving of remembrance. Further particulars. And now, as we often do, we turn to the Victorian press for a little side note that caught our eye this week. One of those cases that begins with a small misunderstanding, takes a sharp turn into the improbable, and ends with the sort of headline that makes you read it twice, very slowly. It comes from Widnes in 1881 and concerns a revolver, 2 teenagers, a young woman, and a chain of decisions so spectacularly ill-timed that even the reporters of the day seemed at a loss for a suitable moral. What unfolds is tragic undeniably, yet the manner of it is so strange, so unintentionally theatrical that it belongs squarely in the category of only in the Victorian newspapers. From the Manchester Evening News, 10th of October, 1881. The tragic affair at Widnes. A young woman and a boy shot dead. The greatest excitement prevails at Widnes through a shocking case of a shooting which happened on Saturday night, by which 2 persons have lost their lives. It appears that Mr. James Burchell, a very extensive draper carrying a business in Waterloo Road, sent one of his shop boys named James Haig, who is about 14 years of age and lived at 8 Wellington Street, to his lodgings at 12 Milton Street for a 4-chambered revolver which he intended presenting to a policeman who was leaving the town for Australia. Another boy named James Atherton went with him and remained outside while Haig went upstairs for the revolver. While Atherton was waiting, he heard a loud report in the kitchen of the discharge of a firearm, and soon after a young woman named Harriet Penlington came to the door and shouted that there had been an accident and he must go and tell Mr. Burchell. Atherton saw Haig lying on the kitchen floor bleeding from the mouth. He ran to tell Mr. Burchell what had occurred, and a young man named Thomas Henry Ethel, who was a lodger at the house, came in at that moment, and the girl said to him, "Oh, Ethel, get something and rub his mouth." She was greatly excited, and Ethel ran out for assistance. A man who lives next door named Samuel Overton then came, and the girl said, "Oh, Mr. Overton, he has shot himself. I'll show you how it happened." And at the same time, she took up the revolver, from the dresser, but Overton ran out for help. He had not gone into the street when he heard a second report, and he turned back. On getting into the house, a horrible sight was presented to his gaze, for 2 bodies were stretched lifeless on the floor, and a second charge having entered through the mouth of the young woman. He was horrified at the sight, called Mr. Brown, surgeon, who was passing at the time, and Dr. O'Keefe arrived shortly afterwards, but they could do nothing. The revolver was lying near the young woman, and the doctors found that both the deceased had been shot in the mouth. No one witnessed the tragic scene, and whether it was one of a mere accident will be left for decision by the coroner's jury. Having navigated the narrow streets of 1918 Liverpool, braved the inquest benches, and survived 1 or 2 alarming trips into the Victorian newspaper psyche, it is at last time to put down our lanterns and restore feelings to our fingertips. If you've enjoyed tonight's wander through historical mayhem, do consider giving this video a like, perhaps even a subscribe, and, should the algorithm be in its unusually benevolent mood, a share. It's a bit like leaving a saucer of milk out for the fates. You never know when it might help. And if you'd like even more stories, early releases, winter specials, and the occasional descent into archival oddity, you're always welcome to join us over on Patreon, where the kettle is permanently on and the cases only get stranger. News of the Times, historical crime, at patreon.com. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, Head of Lantern Maintenance, Assistant Deputy to the Keeper of Misplaced Footnotes, and an honorary curator of unwise Victorian life choices. With the last person out, please make sure the cheese and biscuits are safely put away and leave out a few carrots for the reindeer. We have it on excellent authority that our house is an officially approved rest stop, and we'd rather not be responsible for a disgruntled dasher. Until next time, keep the lamps steady and the curiosity lively.